The list of issues facing the LGBT community is as long as it is pressing. The lives of LGBT individuals in the United States are often marked by violence and discrimination that have nothing to do with marital status. Given these substantial needs in other facets of life, it would be a grave mistake for the LGBT movement to prioritize same-sex marriage. I will begin by responding to my opponent's arguments in favor of the proposition. His first argument is signaling. He says that the achievement of same-sex marriage would be a symbolic challenge to the notion that LGBT people are second-class citizens and would lead to advancements in other areas of discrimination. I believe that neither history nor common sense bear out this claim. A comparison of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s seems apt in this instance. During that time, racial minorities were facing discrimination and violence on a daily basis. The leaders of the movement decided that the most prudent strategy to resolve this was to push for legal action to end de jure discrimination, hoping that it would create a world of racial peace that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. famously dreamed of. They met this goal with the decision in Brown v. Board of Education, which ruled that segregation was unconstitutional, as well as the passage of the Civil Rights Act, which banned government discrimination based on race, sex, religion, or national origin in a variety of areas. But these legal victories did little to end the racism that we can still see endemic to American culture to this day. From this historical example, we can see that a legal victory for the LGBT community would not cure the wide-ranging discrimination that these people face daily. But I don't need to rely on the historical record to prove my point. Common sense also denies the spillover claim that my opponent makes. At the beginning of his speech, he acknowledges that there is widespread conservative opposition, especially from religious groups, to the concept of same-sex marriage. Are we really expected to believe that, when faced with the achievement of same-sex marriage, these groups would simply accept reforms in other areas of society? I find it more likely that it would catalyze the opposition and make gains in other areas even more difficult. To be clear, I do not believe that we should base our decisions on a strategy of appeasing homophobes, but it seems prudent to think that we should begin our efforts with smaller reforms and work our way upwards to achieve our goals, rather than beginning by prioritizing the biggest issue that we can. The second argument that my opponent makes is that allowing same-sex marriage is a way to queer the status quo. He believes that the inclusion of LGBT people in the institution of marriage will challenge the dominant modes of thought and culture. I should begin by pointing out that this argument is a bit of a red herring, since the question is not whether same-sex marriage is desirable, but rather whether it should be the top priority of the movement. Proving that same-sex marriage would queer the status quo does not justify its place as the number one issue within the movement. I would also question the causal claim that my opponent makes. He believes that the inclusion of LGBT people in marriage would somehow change marriage. I believe that the reverse of that is more likely to be true. As my opponent points out, marriage is a culturally powerful institution with roots far deeper than the equality movement. But it is in fact so powerful that even a fundamental change to its nature is unlikely to radically alter it. The basic tenets of marriage, such as the ceremony, the ring, the honeymoon, and legal benefits that couples enjoy, would all remain the same. In fact, the inclusion of LGBT people into such a powerful institution would be more likely to assimilate those people into the dominant modes of thought that my opponent criticizes. The experience of being an LGBT couple would be homogenized and made to seem the same as the experience of a heterosexual couple. This would be damaging to the LGBT community. To fight for the same exact marriage process as heterosexual couples would deny the unique experience of being lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender person. The LGBT community should celebrate its differences, not seek to whitewash them through inclusion in heteronormative structures. Now I will advance two independent arguments why same-sex marriage should not be the top priority of the LGBT movement. First, marriage is not the most pressing issue facing LGBT people in America. Every day, LGBT people are denied employment on the basis of discrimination alone. This makes supporting themselves and their families extremely difficult. Every day, LGBT people are assaulted because they're different. They experience not only physical, but psychological damage that can sometimes last a lifetime. Every day, young LGBT people are bullied in school. As we've seen recently, this bullying can sometimes be so severe that it drives these young people to suicide. These issues are real, widespread, and inflict significant damage on LGBT people. Marriage, while important, does not affect nearly as many people as other issues do, nor do they affect them as drastically. A focus on same-sex marriage would take time, energy, and resources away from the movement that could otherwise be used to fight these terrible forms of discrimination. A lawyer who is litigating for the right to marry cannot sue schools who don't stop bullying. Support groups who are busy protesting marriage inequality cannot be at home counseling the victims of assault. The focus of the movement is a precious thing, and should be directed at the most pressing issues. I will conclude by pointing out that by not prioritizing marriage, I do not mean to say that we should never have it achieved. Marriage is a fundamental right that should be afforded equally to all people. But we should think of it as a sequencing issue. As I mentioned earlier, a high-level attack on the institution of marriage is unlikely to trickle down to ending other forms of discrimination. But by challenging discrimination on a day-to-day level in areas such as bullying, violence, and employment, the movement can slowly change cultural attitudes surrounding LGBT people. This would make an eventual push for marriage equality not only appropriate, but more likely to succeed.